Because right now, we are invested in our own destruction and we don't even know it. It's amazing, and it's global. A lot of ESG data from Sustainalytics, MSCI, Refinitiv, that's scraped data that the company puts out. So a lot of that is misleading. In the United States, we have, I think it's 17 times the amount of glyphosate in our food, in our bread, in our pasta than in the rest of the world. They put a Starbucks cup in the recycling bin and they put a tracker on it, and it ended up in landfill. Starbucks says they're recycling, but they're actually just throwing it in landfill. But I think what differentiates As You Sow, we develop so much data. Right now, we're working on racial justice database on 3,000 companies. And so all this data becomes very actionable.
This is going to be a different kind of discussion. Until now, I've only interviewed investors. And so I'd like to get some of the background from you on that to put in context everything else that you're doing there. And I believe, if my research is right, you grew up in Connecticut on Long Island Sound. I think that's where you first saw your environment being impacted by industry.
Yeah, I grew up in a town called Westport, Connecticut, which at the time was a lot of apple orchards and it's on Long Island Sound. And as a kid, I was just spent a lot of time at the beach. And what happened is basically, two things. One, there was a coal-fired power plant in the nearby town of Bridgeport that was dumping toxic waste into Long Island Sound. And the second was that the town decided to build a landfill on a river that flowed out into the Sound. And so, we went from, being able to gather mussels at the beach to suddenly signs were up, it was toxic. And it was quite I remember the moment as a kid, just saying, what happened here? What's going on? And it made me very aware of my environment and the fact that what could be pristine could very, very rapidly decline and become very polluted to the point where you could not go in the water. And so I think that gave me a sensibility of, just that you can lose things. And what we've seen, obviously, through my lifetime is certainly the loss of species, the loss of ecosystems, what we're doing to the oceans now with dumping plastics into them, what we've done to the atmosphere, dumping carbon in. So industry externalizing their costs impacts all of society. And I was very aware of that as a child.
Yeah. Did you spend all your childhood in Connecticut there, or? Yeah,
I grew up in Westport, went to public school, graduated, and then ended up going to college in New York, which was nearby. So about an hour train ride, and went to NYU, and then lived in New York for about 15 years in the city.
But then you moved to Duke after that. Is that correct?
I actually, from high school, I went to Duke for 2 years, but transferred to NYU. It was not a great fit for me down in Durham, North Carolina. So I graduated from NYU.
Okay. And that was in communications and media. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did a kind of a mixed program of filmmaking, but also media and journalism. So my intention was to do documentary work, become a producer for 60 Minutes kind of things. What ended up happening, though, was I ended up making a bunch of documentary films, feature-length films, and started a small production company, actually, with my wife. We did a lot of very high-tech media. So we were developing all kinds of new technology and got very much into high-tech software and communications. So I was very early on working in 1994, I had a web development company, and we built a lot of big installations for World's Fairs, interactive networks for governments. We did a big project called Info New York, where we built these kiosks in New York that you could slide your credit card and your driver's license in, and it would talk to a bunch of mainframes in Albany, mainframes in downtown, and essentially could do all the functions of the government. This was pre-web, and we developed our own browsers. So always doing these innovative technology projects, which led me to the next phase, my second career, if you will. My first doing all that media work, films and all that kind of tech, into doing startups. And I started a medical device company that created a shirt that monitored your health and transmitted the data back to the doctors. And the idea was to innovate healthcare, to deliver actionable data to doctors so they could actually diagnose you before you even got into your office. We were able to predict strokes 5 days ahead of time. we could actually tell a person's state of mind. And I'm actually an inventor on 5 patents. We define these algorithms based on breathing rates, breathing volumes, and heart rate variability that could predict emotional states. And we got contracts with the Army. We had these on Rangers in Afghanistan. We were bouncing data off of AWACS to the Pentagon. We were working with Homeland Security. Did a lot of research around how to prevent first responders and firefighters, how to prevent death from heat stroke. And so anyway, again, developing a lot of new technology, high tech. So I've always been leading software teams and kind of, always on that kind of cutting edge. And that served me well when I moved into As You Sow. I started there in 2010. I've been there 13 years. The organization's been around since 1992, so 31 years. And it's a 501c3. It's a nonprofit. It's my first time working at a nonprofit, which is very different. But bringing that sense of actionable data into the nonprofit space is, I think, what differentiates As You Sow. We develop so much data. We're putting out 10 original reports every year. Right now, we're working on, racial justice database on 3,000 companies, diversity, equity, inclusion, plastics. These are all corporate scorecards. One on plastics, one on pesticides, which includes regenerative ag as well as pesticides. We're doing one that's linking executive compensation to emissions reduction, one on net zero. And so all this data becomes very actionable when it's put out to the public. And we also develop all these tools to help the public to use it. So analyzing mutual funds, every month we update a database of 3,000 mutual funds, and we rate and rank them on all different types of things. But no one's ever known what's inside your mutual fund. No one has ever understood what's in your retirement plan, what's in your 401k. And people are always shocked because we show you exactly what's in there. If it's a Russell 1000, we show you 1,000 companies. If you look at the prospectus, they show you the top 10. And people don't realize that they are invested in the extractive economy, that they may think they're in something else, but actually what they're owning is, oil, gas, private prisons, all kinds of things that people are very, very surprised. And not only that, they've abdicated their right to vote. They've abdicated their power to companies like Vanguard and BlackRock, who are voting against their best interests. So I think it's really important to have the data sets available so that people can make informed decisions on the money, their money that they've earned, and the influence and power that they have abdicated without even knowing they had it.
Right. Now, that's interesting. But your filmmaking career went on for quite a while, right? You didn't only do this. You won a nomination at Sundance for Tie-Dyed, for the most dedicated fans in rock and roll, no?
The feature-length films were really more of a labor of love. My wife and I had this production company. We were making money building World's Fair pavilions and building science museums and doing all kinds of big installations and inventing all kinds of technology things. Did a lot of stuff in Vegas, actually. We built, if you've never been to the MGM Grand, there's an 80 projector video wall. We designed, we built that, all the systems and it connects to all the laser shows, light shows, fountain shows. So all the controllers and stuff. So that's how we were making our money. And then when we'd make a little money, we'd say, let's go make a movie. And we'd go make a movie. And they would get distributed, but it wasn't like I earned a career making the documentary films. Those were more of we'd work really hard and then we'd save up and then we'd go spend it on a movie. It's just, what can I say? We were.
Because you joined As You Sow in 2010, your journey to doing shareholder activism full time, was personal.
I mean, along the way, there were a lot of personal experiences. For instance, we moved from New York to California. And when we did, almost immediately, and we left New York, we had a son, we had a 2-year-old son pregnant with our second son. I have 3 sons. And we moved to Southern California. And almost immediately, they announced that they were going to start to spray malathion across all the homes in the San Fernando Valley because they detected some fruit flies in some backyard, lemon trees. And we were just come from New York. And we were like, what the hell? So I went to the store. I'd never heard of malathion. And looked at a bottle of malathion and I looked at the side effects of it and we're like, holy shit, this is toxic poison. And the funny, because the announcements, they said it's totally safe, but cover your car because it might eat through the paint, and don't leave out any kids' toys because you don't want your kids to touch them. It's like, well, what about the lawn? I mean, what about just the sidewalks? Anyway, so what happened from that is my realization, my reading, led me to talk to my neighbors, which led to organizing a neighborhood group, which spread to other neighborhoods. And pretty soon there were all these parents who were, protesting at the, where the helicopters were going to take off to spray our neighborhoods, blocking the roads to hundreds of neighbors. It just started to spread. And everybody was like, no, we don't want these helicopters flying over our houses and poisoning our children. And so I realized, wow, that was just from asking some questions. Like everybody said, I have to protect my kids. So then I started, there was a thing called Big Green in California. It was a ballot initiative. And so I'm out there and I've got a stroller. I got, a little kid. I got my other son. We just go door to door. And I signed up to be a precinct captain. I'd never been involved with politics. But knocking on doors and talking to people and what do they think? And anyway, what happened is, I ended up becoming a precinct captain in 2 precincts. And it turned out those 2 precincts had the largest vote for Big Green in all of California. I went to the election night event. We did not win, but they called me up and gave me an award because I was like, I just went knocking door to door. I realized, wow, that was kind of powerful. Just actually talking to people one-on-one. What do they care about? What does this mean? What is Big Green going to do? That those people went and they turned out at the polls because they felt passionate about it. And so I started to understand that. And then we moved up to a little town called Ojai, which actually in the news just had an earthquake yesterday. Again, we land there, and within a week or two, Waste Management, the largest in the country, announces they're going to put a huge dump right in the mouth of the valley, right on top of this low-income community. And the way the winds would blow, it would just blow toxic fumes up the valley and into Ojai, which is this beautiful little, 6,000 people in this beautiful farming community. And again, we put up some signs and said, hey, we're going to have a conversation about this at the high school. The entire town showed up. We were shocked. And we had just moved there maybe a month or 2 ago. So we had some friends. We had this meeting. Everybody signed up. And that turned into a 5-year organizing effort, raising money, having concerts, getting the county supervisors to actually oppose the dump. And what evolved out of it, which was interesting, is the realization that we didn't actually need the dump. That if people started to recycle and compost, there was absolutely no need. When we brought in experts and they did this analysis. So that led us into a whole campaign that actually put recycling and composting on the ballot. And it took 5 years for Waste Management to say no more. And it turned, I actually started to organize. I remember I was talking to the guy who ran the Ojai Valley News. They said, it was an off-year election. And only they expected 20% of people to show up. I said, if every person in Ojai voted with this turnout and the rest of the county voted for it, we'd actually win. And so the next day the headline of the paper was, Behar demands 100% turnout. And there's my picture. And I'm like, what did you do? And I'm getting all these phone calls from people, companies saying, oh, you can use all our phones, and restaurants saying, we'll feed your crew. People saying, I want to volunteer. So it's all right, I got to throw myself at this. And for 6 weeks, just organized people calling. And we called every person in the county, and we won the ballot initiative by 70%. So Waste Management, no more, they left. But part of it was this whole realization we didn't need the dump, that it was just, if you start thinking in a different way, and which has led to composting, recycling, all kinds of things that came out of that. So when I came to As You Sow in 2010, I had all that kind of personal background.
I think you actually, after that waste management thing, you got asked to write a strategic plan for As You Sow, didn't you?
It was actually quite a bit after that, because when my youngest son left for college in 2008, my wife and I moved up to San Francisco. We were New Yorkers. We wanted to get back into little more city life. And that's when I bumped into a friend of mine, Tom Van Dyke, who had founded As You Sow in 1992. I knew Tom from back in 1980 when I was doing film and stuff. He had asked me to, we had met through mutual friends, and he asked me to make some TV ads and radio spots in New York. He wanted to close the Indian Point nuclear reactor north of Manhattan. And so I helped him with that. We stayed friends, lifelong friends. And so just had lunch with him. And he said, As You Sow has been doing it great work for 18 years, but it really needs a strategic plan. And you've written dozens of business plans. Would you be interested? And I went, I don't know. Let me go look. I went in, I met everybody. I looked at what they've been doing, and just the theory of change, the idea that corporations have all this power and that as shareholders, we have certain rights to actually ask these companies to reduce the material risk to all stakeholders. And by doing that, by making a decision at a company level, at a board level, it impacts, like when Walmart makes a decision, all their employees, all their customers, their entire supply chain, millions of people are impacted. And if that decision is good for all those people, all those employees, all those customers, all those supply chains, the communities where they operate, and for shareholders, then it's a win-win. And so I saw this and went, this is actually a solution. This is a place where you can find and build solutions. And so I wrote the strategic plan, and the board asked me to stay on and execute it. And so that's what I've been doing for 13 years.
What was As You Sow pre-Andrew Behar from 1992 to 2010? And then where did you take it since then?
So it was originally founded to be a plaintiff in what are called Proposition 65 cases. So in 1986, there was a ballot initiative that was passed in California. And what it said is any person who sees that there's a consumer product, so it could be a food, it could be cosmetics, or any product that has very high levels of carcinogens and reproductive toxicants. And they listed exactly, there's 806 of them with specific levels for each of them. The company would need to either put a label and say, we have high levels of lead, cadmium, formaldehyde, or they have to reformulate. It was very simple. And that's why California is a much safer place to live than any other state, because it's the only state that does this. And it's pretty remarkable. So As You Sow was actually created to be a plaintiff in these cases. So for instance, the first cases were with nail polish, Revlon, formaldehyde and toluene in nail polish. As You Sow was a plaintiff, filed the case, they reformulated. So again, nail polishes in California are much safer than in New York or anywhere else. Anyway, hundreds of these cases. And what happened is when you do these cases, sometimes there's a settlement, and some of the money can be used for other purposes that are related. And so As You Sow, since we were back in the early days, relating to and interacting with all these companies, said, well, there's other things these companies are doing we could talk to them about as well. And that's where the shareholder advocacy piece came in, which had been really pioneered by the faith-based groups, by the Jesuits in 1970 with General Motors and apartheid. There's a whole group called the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. It's been doing this since literally the 1970s and doing an amazing job. This whole community of folks, at Walden and Trillium and all these different socially responsible investors that have been using the power of their shares. And so As You Sow started to do that as well, specifically on environmental health issues and sustainability issues. What I did when I came in was I realized, okay, this is a great basis, but we need to be looking at energy issues, at climate issues, at social issues like racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, CEO pay. So I expanded out the programmatic coverage and started the first resolutions and the first engagements when I started had to do with coal ash. So Duke Power, the largest power company in the United States. And that was really about, the Tennessee Valley Authority had just had a major coal ash spill that wiped out a town of Kingston, Tennessee. And I saw that Duke is storing our coal ash the same way. What if we had an accident? This could be very bad for shareholders and for all stakeholders and for the community particularly. And so we started filing resolutions around that, which led us into the whole world of hydraulic fracturing and the wastewater disposal and fracking. I think it was probably an important moment. I went out to Wyoming and went out and took a couple of days and went through all the fracking fields. I took basically a tour of what was actually going on, where they were doing this fracking and how they were storing the wastewater. And it was unbelievable, just laying waste to just swaths of the country. And anyway, so we got involved with energy, which led to big oil, starting to talk to utilities, then pipelines, petrochemical plants, which led us into banks. Actually, that happened during the Dakota Access Pipeline. All these banks were making loans to companies that were putting up this pipeline across sacred indigenous land. And here were, the indigenous tribes were protesting, and they were sicking dogs on them and spraying them with water in sub-zero temperatures. So we went to the banks and said, hey, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Citibank, do you realize that our brand, we're shareholders, is associated now with this kind of activity? And they're like, no, what do you mean? We just lend money to this company. We don't know what they're doing with it. So, well, you should know. We should know what we're doing with it, because our brand is now tied to the loans that made this pipeline possible. So that led into this whole concept of financed emissions, that when a bank makes a loan, it needs to be responsible, and it needs to also disclose that information to shareholders, so shareholders can say, I don't want to be associated with that risk, or I accept that risk. It's really it's a material piece of information. Material is a very important concept, materiality. And what it means is information a shareholder needs to make a buy or sell decision. Companies are required by law to disclose that. And yet, many don't do a good job of it, and many disclose misleading information. And so this is why we're hoping the SEC, the new rule, the climate disclosure rule, which all it's about is saying when a company discloses material information, it's accurate, verified by a third party, and in a standardized format. It's the most basic function of the SEC. And a lot of people are very opposed to it. So right now, it's really about climate information, so greenhouse gas emissions, but it really should apply to any material information. So information about racial justice, about diversity, equity, inclusion. We know that those are material issues. And in fact, last year we came out with a report where we looked at 277 companies in terms of diversity, and we could see the association between the ones that had more diverse workforces outperformed on 14 key financial metrics. We're about to come out with now a new study, same methodology, but looking at 4,000 companies. So now we have statistical significance, and we have the same findings. So investors who want to place a bet, if you will, on a company and want to outperform their portfolios should be looking for companies that have greater diversity. It's just there, it's in the math. And so, again, actionable data.
Host Andrew Behar, you've broadened out the scope of what you're including and the topics that you're going after. And you're doing research on all of that, I believe.
Really focusing on the actionable data. That, to me, is the core of As You Sow, is doing the research, putting out the data to find solutions. And it's not oppositional with the companies. We are helping the companies. Last year, we had 211 engagements. We sat down with 211 companies to share our data. 98 of those said, you guys are like McKinsey for free. Thank you. This is actually incredibly helpful. If we implement these ideas, we'll all get bonuses. Our company's going to do better. The other companies that weren't so quick to move, we escalated by filing a shareholder resolution, which means now all the shareholders can discuss our findings, our data, and they can vote on it. And they can make a recommendation to the board. It's non-binding. And once we did that, half of those companies agreed to terms, and we withdrew. So out of the 211, about, I think it's 22% went to a vote. And those, again, votes are non-binding. It's part of the conversation. It's part of a continuous conversation with the companies that is generally very positive and trying to help our companies to outperform.
On your tenure, you've developed tools, something called Invest Your Values tool. I guess that allows retail investors to look through the funds that they own to understand the underlying exposure to fossil fuels and carbon.
Yeah, that was an interesting evolution. That came out of necessity, really. What happened is we were talking to a lot of people in around 2011, 2012, there are a whole bunch of student groups that wanted their endowments to divest from fossil fuels. They said, look, we want a livable planet. And the mission of our schools is to help us find our future. And yet we're making money from the companies that are destroying our future. And so what we realized is all these people wanted to divest. Nobody knew what they owned. Nobody who worked at the schools even knew what they owned. They didn't know what was in their own 403B plans. The professors had no idea. There's 100 million people with $10 trillion that have not a clue how they're invested. And so we realized, wow, we don't know how we're invested. As You Sow had a 401k plan. And so I spent weeks trying to figure it out. I literally was scraping websites. I was doing this, couldn't figure it out. I was reading prospectuses, and all you could see was the top 10 holdings. And so one of our staffers, who was actually running our communications department, who was kind of a coder by night, he wrote some code to actually figure it out. And when we looked at it, we went, oh my gosh, it's totally out of alignment with what we're doing. I brought all the staff together and said, this is what our 401k plan is. What does everybody think? And they said, this is just horrifying. We called up our investment advisor and said, we want to change. He goes, you can't. So we said, you're fired, got a new one. And within about 3 months, we had a brand new plan that actually satisfied everybody's needs. So there were fossil-free options. There were ones that promoted gender equality. That's when we started the website, Fossil Free Funds, because we wanted to share what we were doing. And then we got a little grant that allowed us to add deforestation. And we got another little grant. We added prisons and then weapons and then gender. It just sort of has grown piece by piece, bit by bit on tiny little grants. I mean, if the funding is really like a reasonable amount of money, we could actually show exactly what's going on with every mutual fund in the entire planet. And the stuff we could do, but it's really pretty amazing. It's called investyourvalues.org. So then we started to aggregate up the mutual funds within a 401k plan. So we could see that even though Amazon, they go, look, we're buying 100,000 electric vehicles. We're doing great on climate. Every employee at Amazon owns companies burning down the Amazon. So we started to let all the employees know, like, aren't you guys like, doesn't your brain hurt from the cognitive dissonance there? And they were like, yeah, it does. And so we reached out to the company and we go, hey, we can help you fix this. This is an easy fix. And you guys will get to take the best victory lap and attract the best and the brightest. Your employees will love you. And they just shut it down. They just said, we're not changing a thing. So we're like, really? And so we filed a shareholder resolution and we're now in our third year. So we did the same with Comcast. They wouldn't change. Microsoft, the employees actually organized. We're in conversations with actually a bunch of employees from Google just called me a couple of weeks ago and said, I can't believe we're funding that I personally own all these oil companies and private prisons too. I mean, Comcast is in Philadelphia. That is the company with the highest incarceration rate in the country. They own more private prisons. And you ask an employee and they're like, I have no idea. And so here's the thing. It's really easy to change it, but the companies for some reason won't do it. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to be coming out with a plan that is going to be cheaper than Vanguard. You'll save money. It's going to be sustainable. And we're going to give everybody the right to vote their own proxies instead of handing them off to Vanguard. And Vanguard votes against every one of our resolutions. Vanguard votes with management 100% of the time. Yeah. And so we just said, you know what? If no one else will do it, we're going to have to do this. And so, I mean, we're not an investment firm, but we're working with all these other folks who are investment people. And we got the voting working and we got the sustainability working. And people are going to be able to save so much more money and be actually to envision a livable planet and to be invested in that. Because right now we are invested in our own destruction and we don't even know it. It's amazing. And it's global. And here's the thing. Going beyond that, there's 27 trillion in pension funds that are doing the same thing. They're all invested in the extractive economy. And in Europe, there's $4 trillion in England that's invested in their own destruction. Until we pull our money out, until we push our capital toward creating a world we want to be in, we're never going to get there. And so that's what we're very focused on.
Well, and to anyone who's listening who's interested to use this tool, which is what you created it for, I might point out that it's offered, as far as I know, absolutely free, which is free in a world where ESG data is increasingly being monetized. So that's notable. And I'll put a link to this tool in the show notes to this episode. And I think you have one other tool that you have called As You Vote.
Since I started at As You Sow, we started publishing our voting guidelines. So in other words, recommendations of how one would vote if you want to be aligned with values that are a livable planet. And so it's kind of an offshoot of, so Proxy Preview, we're going to be publishing our 20th year of Proxy Preview. So every March we come out with, here's all the proxies, here's all the resolutions that are being filed at all the companies. And just so you can have like a preview to the voting season. So As You Sow, we're filing resolutions across almost every issue area, but we know all the other folks. And we wanted to also bring attention to all of them and all the good work they do, and to give them credit and put their picture in their name, because these people are just don't get much love at all. But anyway, so what As You Vote did, we took our voting policy. So, for instance, we were going to vote against a nominating committee of a board if you have less than 50% women. We're going to vote against overpaid CEOs. We're going to vote for resolutions that are, about climate disclosure, etc. But we turned it into an actual tool, and we put it on the Broadridge Proxy Edge platform. So now we have subscribers. There are asset managers and endowments and, colleges and all kinds of people. They can actually subscribe. And so they choose our policy, and then it's automatically voted on their behalf. We then did a deal with another platform called Iconic, ICONIK. And this is for individuals. So if you own 50 shares of Apple and 100 shares of IBM or whatever, you're probably getting proxy statements into your inbox. And most people don't vote them. In fact, 25% of every vote is simply not voted. People basically throw away their mail-in ballots. One click, you can now align it with our policy. We'll vote our policy on your shares for everything. We voted 13,000 items for one university last year. And we have it automated. We have it built into a system that's a rules-based engine. And so if you see proxy statements piling up in your inbox and you're feeling guilty and saying, why don't I do it? The reason you're not doing it is because when you open one, you've got 25 choices to make, and there's no way you're going to know every single person, every director, the auditor, say on pay. We know all that stuff. We have created databases and actionable data on every issue, and we're voting it automatically. By the way, and that's free. The Iconic is free. If you're an individual, no cost, go there, click. We'll vote everything. And what you'll get, though, in your inbox is a thank you for voting. And I got to tell you, the people who have felt guilty for years now get a thank you for voting, and they feel great. And the other thing that's great is when you get that thank you for voting, you can log in and you can then, it's already pre-voted. We've voted it. You can then say, you know what? I like this person you're voting against on the board because his name is Scott. I vote for anybody named Scott. And you can switch. You can customize it however you like. If that's what you like, that's what you can do. And you hit submit. It's now submitted. And there's a record that you customized it to yourself.
Well, I'll put a link to that tool as well in the show notes. And two more questions really quick, just on the overview, because I've got a lot of things I hope that we can get to. How many employees do you have at As You Sow?
37.
How are you funded?
Fund about 70%, 75% from foundation grants. We write about 60 grant proposals every year and about 60 reports. It's a huge amount of work. And the rest is the other 25 to 30% are major donors and individuals. I mean, we get $5 gifts from people. We get larger gifts from people. I try to phone every single one who gives us a gift. Every week I call up people who gave us $10 and say, hi, thank you. Because we really appreciate it. When individuals make gifts, it's unrestricted, which means that we can use it to pivot, to be really nimble. And that's really important type of money for us, because a lot of the grants coming from foundations are restricted. Like you can only use this for ocean plastics. You can only use this for antibiotics. So having that versatility is really important.
Let me move on. And as I said, when we started, everyone talks about shareholder engagement. Not sure everyone has the same understanding. So I'd like to drill down, but before we get down in the weeds a little more, can you give me a clear definition and description of what you consider shareholder engagement, shareholder activism is. And then maybe after that, I don't know if there's anything that some people believe is shareholder activism that you think isn't. So I'd like an example of what it's not and what it is, just at the high level, and then we'll go down and drill down a little more in details on how you do this.
So first of all, let's just talk about words. So shareholder activism is a phrase that has been captured by what used to be called corporate raiders, the Carl Icahn type people. So they didn't like being called corporate raiders, and so they got big PR agencies. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to be branded as shareholder activists. So those are folks who are running dissident board slates, generally to take over a board to liquidate a company. Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. We are not shareholder activists. We are shareholder advocates. We are advocating for the company. We're advocating for all the stakeholders in the company. So just language-wise, and I know that's maybe sounds like a nuance, but there is a difference. So what I consider engagement starts with research. Figure out what are the key performance indicators that you're looking for. If you look at our pesticides report, there's 35 ways that we're measuring a company. How do they use pesticides? What are their policies on it? Who set those policies? If you go to the actual report, you will see them all. And we have, by the way, an online data visualization tool. So you can see all 35 of them transparently and how every company scores on each one. We develop these with the companies. So the metrics that we're using are the metrics by which a company will measure itself. That's critically important. Same thing with plastics. Again, we have about 40 key performance indicators. On racial justice and DEI, we have 61. These evolved from bringing together expert committees, companies, testing them, all of that. So what's most important is how you measure things. Then you have to measure things. So we have teams of researchers who go out and measure. Then engagement starts. Well, engagement actually started with the development of the KPIs, and that's an engagement because you're talking to companies, you're developing a relationship. Now you have your results, and you sit down with the company and go, hi, you scored a 7. Your direct competitors scored an 11. Here's the 2 things they're doing you're not. The cost of doing these 2 things is X. The cost of not doing these 2 things, the risk involved, means you won't be competitive. You're going to harm your brand. And so just the cost benefit ratio is very, very in favor of doing these things. So we sit down and we do a presentation like that. And the companies generally say, you're right, or we need our scientists to look at this too. And then we work with them and they come back and go, you're right. You guys do really good research. And we're going to go and implement that. That's it. That's engagement. And that to us is how it should work 100% of the time. And it works that way about 50% of the time. Like I said, 98 companies last year out of 211. So whatever.
You're not the only people who have ESG data and scoring and all that. So there's no standardization on an awful lot of it. And that's kind of a problem that I think exists in the sustainable and responsible management business. Can you make that somehow your KPIs real, and how does it relate to what else is going on and the other tools that investors might be using in the marketplace, which management, I guess, has to keep an eye on all that too? I mean, can it conflict or not?
I mean, I'm going to call up one of our scorecards and just read you off the level of detail that we get into, because it's important to understand that. So a lot of ESG data, say from Sustainalytics, MSCI, Refinitiv, that's scraped data that the company puts out. So a lot of that is misleading. So what you've got is, just because MSCI scraped it or Sustainalytics scraped it and put it into a database doesn't make it true, doesn't make it real. And that's the problem, is a lot of people base their decisions on these data sets that are based on misleading scraped data. We don't do that. We don't think that that's a good way to do it. We have our own researchers doing our own research. When we sit down with a company, we're not basing it on hearsay. Now, we also looking at what the company stated, because in order to be material, the company has to publicly state it. But then we question the company. So I'm going to read off some KPIs. And if I get too much in the weeds, so I am on currently our plastics pollution scorecard. I have clicked on Kellogg. So here's a pillar. One pillar is packaging design. Action in the last 2 years to increase recyclability of packaging used in the U.S. They got a yes. Action in the last 2 years to directly and innovatively eliminate packaging. Anyway, this is very long. There's 35 of them. Another pillar is reusable packaging. Another pillar is packaging transparency. One is recycled content. One is called producer responsibility. That means, are you paying for the systems to actually gather and reuse stuff? Supporting recycling. So it's that level of detail. And when we talk to the companies, this is revealed. So again, it's very different than the scraped data or, like a group like Just Capital. They do a survey. So they're just getting people's impressions of, they do a survey every year about how are people feeling about things. So we're very different than that. And so when we sit down with a company, there's a great deal of respect for the data we've gathered. And if they have a question about the data that we have, we also give them an opportunity to correct it. So we're about to publish 3,000 companies that we have researched on racial justice and DEI. We're about to post that and send a letter to every one of the companies and say, look, you've got 2-3 weeks. Look at your score. If there's anything we got wrong, please correct it before we go live. We always do this. So again, there's a respectful relationship. And that's why the engagements work, because they know that we're sitting shoulder to shoulder with them looking at a problem. We're not across the table. This is not oppositional.
Do you calculate, I guess it depends on which domain you're working in, but do you calculate the cost of not having a good score? Because I think you've referred to that this is, in the long term, better earnings, less risk for the company. Do you bring it down to hard numbers?
Well, that's why about 75% of our proposals get accepted, because we do that. So an example is, let's say, diversity, equity, inclusion. Their absolute association with a more diverse workforce outperforms on 14 key financial metrics: return on capital, return on investment, just everything. And so when we sit down with a company and go, here's the numbers, you guys don't have a lot of diversity, your direct competitor does. We think that's going to mean that they're going to outperform you, which means investors are going to shift their capital toward them. Do you want to see that happen? On racial justice, do you want your brand associated with ignoring racial justice? You have not done anything positive, or you've got a lot of environmental violations and you have lawsuits with communities, fence-line communities of color that you have not settled. You haven't talked to these communities. That's not good for our brand. That means that capital is going to shift to other people. Why are we doing this? What kind of decision? We sit down with companies on political spending. Sat down with Coca-Cola just to, I guess it was a few years ago now, and said, who's in charge here? Like, why are we alienating 50% of our market share? And they're like, what are you talking about? We just gave all this political contributions to all these state representatives that passed this heartbeat bill. Anyone who believes a woman has the right to choose will never drink a Coca-Cola again. Who the hell is in charge here? And they look at us and go like, we did? And we're like, yes, you did. Here's the data. And they're like, oh my gosh. Now that led to them completely reforming how they do their political spending, because no one there had a clue. We just don't think companies should be giving political money to either radical side, because you're going to alienate your market share. It's like, so those are the kind of discussions that we have.
I suppose it depends on what it is. Like in the case of toxicity, then you have, potential legal and liability risk. Some of the examples you gave are reputational risk, so that'll impair the cost of capital, perhaps in the future.
The number one cost in COGS are retaining your employees. Like when you lose an employee who says, I don't want to work for this company because they have a bad reputation or the culture is really bad, the cost of replacing that person and training them is the number one cost. That's in COGS and cost of goods sold. That is the number one cost. So creating a culture that retains the people. And when people are proud of their jobs and proud of their company, look at the McKinsey numbers. You get, if the baseline is just people performing at 100%, you get 150 to 200% if people love their company and love their brand. The productivity goes off the charts. So again, this is just basic business 101. Is I want to invest in a management team that's addressing risk, assessing risk, and addressing risk, is measuring it and is dealing with those metrics. That's where I want to make my investments. So that's what we're doing. We're just helping them to identify opportunities.
As an example of a successful engagement campaign in 2017, you approached Kellogg's and General Mills, to discuss pesticides and regenerative agriculture. Can you talk about what happened there as an example?
Sure. So, well, two things. One was there's this chemical called glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, and it's part of the industrial agriculture in the United States. So there's two ways it's being used. One, as part of GMO corn, they're called Roundup Ready. So you plant your corn, starts to grow, the weeds start to grow, you spray the whole field. The corn, when it gets hit with this carcinogenic chemical, doesn't die because it's been genetically modified. The weeds die. So first of all, you've got glyphosate in the water systems and everywhere. But that's not what we were actually, so we know we don't like glyphosate in our food. But then they also spray it at the end of life. So right when they're about to harvest the wheat, they aerial spray glyphosate because this is non-GMO wheat, it kills it. And so when the threshers come through, you don't have any green wheat. It's all the same brown, basically. And so it's on the kernels of the wheat, the oats, the beans. It's in our food system. In the United States, we have, I think it's 17 times the amount of glyphosate in our food, in our bread, in our pasta than in the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't do this because in Europe, they have what's called the precautionary principle. You have to prove something safe before you can put it in your food. In the US, we have the opposite. You can put anything in your food and you have to prove that somebody died and that there's causation in order to have it removed. We've only had 4 chemicals removed since 1975. Okay. So the US, we're basically just toxifying our citizens. So we went to Kellogg. We said, look, your whole supply chain is doing this. This glyphosate, there's just been recently 2 lawsuits for people who spritzed a little glyphosate in their backyard to knock down the weeds. And they got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So they got cancer. One of them was a $200 million settlement and one was a $400 million settlement. It's in every bowl of Special K. This is going to be bigger than tobacco. People will realize the connection and they'll realize they're eating it every single day. And it's just like the risk is massive. And the board, we're talking at the board level, went, oh my gosh, this, it's absolutely clear. And so they said, okay, we're going to make a pledge. So truncating time, it took 2 years of their scientists working with us to actually validate what we were saying. They made a commitment to shift their entire supply chain to non-pre-harvest glyphosate. So eliminating that, making food safer to eat. Same time, we're talking to General Mills, and General Mills is having a problem because with these climate-induced superstorms, heat waves, droughts, floods, all this, just all this weather that is reducing the ability for commodities to be grown. They realize that their supply chain is not very resilient. And we pointed out that farmers who use regenerative agriculture, who rotate crops, who have a cover, use cover crops, during a drought, they retain water much better. During a flood, the soil doesn't get washed away, that they have a much higher probability of actually delivering the crops. And General Mills, again, took 2 years. They're scientists. And we did a webinar when we announced they also signed a pledge to shift to regenerative agriculture. Their scientist, their PhD agronomist, got on and said, we are doing this because General Mills needs a more resilient supply chain in the face of climate-induced superstorms. That is their reason. It's purely economic. It's purely business. Makes total sense logically. Now, what that did is it led Pepsi to say, okay, we'll do 7 million acres. And so when we started this in 2017, no one was doing pesticide reduction. No one was doing regenerative ag, or, they were, but not at the kind of big company level. In 2019, we published the first pesticide in the pantry report. Just those 2 companies were scoring well. 2021, almost half of the companies had followed those 2 leaders. And now we're publishing a 2023 version. We're in the research right now to see, okay, what else has changed in the last 2 years? What are other people doing? Has it continued in the same path? Is it dropping off or is it increasing? So I'll have more information, I think, in pesticide in the pantry. At the end of October, we'll be publishing that data.
All right. I think you said that about half of these campaigns or contacts, engagements with companies end up being kind of amicably resolved, that they view you almost like McKinsey for free. Can you walk me through your escalation process and what are the various levers that you and shareholders have in those situations?
Sure. So every year, every company has what's called an annual general meeting. An AGM is the acronym, but call it an annual meeting. 6 months prior to that day, any shareholder who owns $2,000 worth of the shares for 3 years can file what's called a shareholder resolution. It's a 500-word document, and it's very precise. The SEC is very prescriptive. It can only address certain issues, and it has to be phrased in a certain way. And so if a company won't agree to have a really good in-faith conversation with us about how they're going to proceed, and that date approaches, so generally those meetings are in the May and June timeframe, so November to December. So we're saying, look, if we can't reach an agreement, we're going to file a resolution. We let them know. So we'll even show you the resolution we're going to file. Most of the companies say, okay. But the ones who don't, we go, okay, look, the date's coming next week. We're going to file it. They go, okay, we couldn't find a path. So we file that resolution. It goes to the company, and the company can now respond in a few different ways. The company can, number one, they can object to the SEC. They could say, wait, you can't ask that. And there's specific rules. So you can't ask for what's called ordinary business. You can't ask for what's called substantially implemented. And you can't ask for what's called micromanagement. So our resolutions never ask for those things. So generally you can ask absolutely for, we would like a report on this material risk of not addressing racial justice, of not addressing toxins in our food system, of dumping ocean plastic, whatever it is. So you can always ask for a report because, again, the companies, as I mentioned before, have a legal obligation for material disclosure. When a shareholder, a bona fide shareholder, asks, this is a material issue, I need it to make a decision if I'm going to buy or sell your stock, they need to do that. So if they do object to the SEC, then they file a brief, then our SEC attorneys file a counter brief, and generally the SEC decides in our favor because we were anticipating that we would have that happen. And last year, I think we had 15. We won, I think we only lost one. So, generally that's just trying to waste our resources. I can tell you we filed probably 35 resolutions with Exxon over the last 12 years, and they have filed 35 no actions just to waste our resources. And they've lost, I think, all but one.
You've given me several good examples of successful campaigns that As You Sow has been a part of.
That was option one for the company. Option two is the company calls you up and says, all right, let's sit down and we'd like you to withdraw it. And you have until 6 weeks before the annual meeting, that's when they publish the proxy statement, to work out an agreement. So half of the ones that we filed reach an agreement before the proxy statement's published. So again, about 50%. Then the rest can go all the way through to a vote. And there's a vote at the annual meeting. Depending on what the vote is, you have we've had some of our biggest companies change, and we've had a 6% vote. Company after the vote said, you know what you're saying is really right. Abbott Labs, we had asked them to produce Similac that had a label that said no GMOs. They were making a formula with no GMOs, and they didn't want to put a label on it. We're like, it's going to increase sales. And we did all this testing, market testing for them. And they did. They put it on the label, and it became their best seller to this day. I mean, There's 5 non-GMO Similacs. So the company listened to us, even though it's a 6% vote, and they just made tons of money. They have a monopoly, basically, on this market of parents who don't want to have GMO products in there for their baby. And just like why the company would object to that and make us file a resolution, I have no idea.
If I've got the math right, about 25% end up going to a vote. Is that right?
Right. And that's where those get all the attention, by the way. That's everyone's focused on these few that get the vote. And generally those are the companies that are the most like, we don't want to change. We don't want to listen to shareholders. And so I guess people, I don't know, that just gets more press attention than the actual work, which is the other 75%.
How does somebody get on your radar? How do you pick your targets, or how do they come to your attention?
Well, racial justice, we're looking at 3,000 companies, so everyone is getting all of our love. Every agriculture company gets our love with pesticides, and all of the companies who are in consumer packaging, fast food, or beverage, they're all getting attention on the plastics. So we look at every company that's in. I mean, you're not going to look at a company that doesn't use any plastics on the plastic report. That's just a waste of everybody's time. So
you're looking at them all, you're saying?
Yeah, on net zero, we're looking at, oh gosh, I think it's like the 200 biggest polluters in terms of emissions. So, we only have, a set amount of resources. So, we restrict it based on resources.
How do you measure the results or outputs of the campaigns that you've been successful on? And how long do you measure them post-campaign? Because I presume you're arguing for a certain action in the campaign. Then if you're successful, do you continue to measure that for a certain period of time in the future or result?
So some withdrawal agreements actually have a time frame and milestones. So an example would be Monster Beverage. They scored a 0 on not one of our scorecards called Know the Chain. It's about slavery and supply chain. And so we called them up, we talked to them, they didn't want to do anything, so we filed a resolution, we got a good vote. They said, you know what, you're right. And they said, we're going to change our entire procurement system, change all of our contracts, all that stuff. And we laid out actually a 5-year timeline. This is in 2018. So what they were going to accomplish in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. And we have meetings with them. And they've actually outperformed every single year. They've more than hit their targets, just a complete transition. And what's remarkable is other companies that we talked to about slavery and supply chain said, impossible. We can't do this in a decade. And we said, look what Monster's done in like their first 10 months. I remember they had like trained 170 staff. They had rewritten all their procurement contracts. They'd brought in outside consultants to do it. But they changed the whole association of their brand. And that was what motivated them, is they didn't want their brand associated with slavery. And so that's the motivation. So how do we measure ourselves? We measure ourselves on companies actually making real change, that it becomes part of the DNA of the company. And so when we do check back with them, it's the relationships. I mean, our relationship at Abbott, we know they're still selling non-GMO Similac because they're making so much money at it. Starbucks, I mean, we asked them to put recycling in their stores. And here's a funny story about, do they really do it? So it wasn't us. It was somebody else. But they put a cup, a Starbucks cup, in the recycling bin, and they put a tracker on it. And it ended up in landfill. And they reported it to local press. And it became a headline that Starbucks says they're recycling, but they're actually just throwing it in landfill. They called us. Now, we had just filed a resolution a few months before about eliminating styrofoam, and they were very resistant to this. That headline hit, again, nothing to do with us, and they called us up and said, what can we do? And we're like, well, you could agree to no styrofoam across all your stores worldwide, complete elimination of styrofoam. It'll probably get you some good press. And they were like, fine, done. So between Starbucks doing that, which then led to Dunkin' doing it, which led to McDonald's doing it, 3 billion styrofoam cups are not being produced, for the last 3 years, every year. You're literally not producing 3 billion styrofoam cups. The demand for fossil fuels to create the feedstock for the styrofoam is no longer needed. So you're reducing demand for fossil fuels. So you can see how that's like a benefit for everybody. And it really came from, our relationship with Starbucks, that they could call us up and say, help us out. We got this bad press. We messed up. We agree, but what do we do?
That's a clever story with the tracker. How do you protect, though, against, you've got a scoring system, the KPIs, and you're going to people with a score. How do you protect against dishonest brokers from gaming your scoring system? Because as soon as you have a report card, then it's going to be like me in physics class, you're going to try to figure out how to get through this.
As a nonprofit, having a third party looking at each number, having experts in the field looking at each KPI is really the only way to do it. That We don't take any money from corporations. So we're unbiased. And so we're just looking for actual truth and evidence. And yeah, sometimes we find that companies have exaggerated or had some misleading information, particularly around climate disclosure. It's really not good. A lot of the numbers that are in the Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP database, are very, very flawed. And they note it. They say, we didn't get accurate disclosure. We're going to make an estimate. So there's a lot of just estimated numbers, which is why rules from the SEC saying you must disclose accurately are so important. The problem right now, it's a very hostile political environment right now. And the SEC is afraid that if they put out this rule, which is just like the most, the purest expression of capitalism, creating trust between companies and their shareholders, they're afraid somebody's going to take it into the courts. It'll go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will say, no, we want to take away all your power. If they took away the EPA's power to enforce clean air and clean water, the Supreme Court is dedicated to this philosophy of neutering all the agencies. And this is there's this guy named Leonard Leo, who's basically gave us our Supreme Court, who runs the Federalist Society, who just got $1.6 billion to create this whole anti-ESG campaign. It's a crusade, really, putting out all this misleading information. ESG is environmental, social, and governance. It's a framework for assessing risk. If you, as an investor, don't want your management teams to be assessing and addressing risk, then I can't imagine that you're going to be very successful. I mean, just think about it. If you're a management team and you're making, say, T-shirts, you got to get cotton. If Pakistan has a massive flood and they have no cotton harvest, Texas lost 70% of their harvest, all these climate-induced superstorms, and you're looking at that and going, where am I going to get my cotton? And you're going to figure it out. You got a higher probability of getting product to market than somebody who says, I don't look at risk. I do not look at risk. You invest in management teams. So the whole concept of it is just anti-business. It's anti-conservative. They're using the cudgel of state government to try to tell companies how to think, how to act. And all the CEOs are going like, no, I need the freedom to operate my company, and investors I want the freedom to invest and use whatever data I need to make a decision. Why are you trying to restrict my data? And so the whole thing is really odd to me. I look at this and go, they're like anti-business, anti-conservative, anti-freedom, and yet they continue. So anyway, that's the political environment. So I don't expect the SEC rule to come out soon. But in Europe, they also are coming out with rules that are going to govern, how to describe these risks, these environmental risks, these social risks, these government risks, because all it is just risk mitigation. I mean, name it what you want. And I know they've demonized the acronym.
Do you see this culture war that's really in the US? I don't really feel it here in Europe. Do you see it impacting shareholder ability to drive corporate change?
I don't see the heads of companies taking it really seriously, other than the ones who want to hide, and they're using it for their own excuses. But the interesting thing is, actually, 5 years ago, there were a lot of companies taking credit for doing stuff, but they weren't doing anything. Greenwashing. Now we see companies actually making change, like doing good work, but they want to remain quiet about it. We call it green hushing. And so it's hard for investors to know, how do I optimize the companies who are doing the best work? Because there are just so many trolls out there, and the crossfire is a little too intense. So the companies are doing the work, and they're just not taking the victory lap.
In a recent article, you stated that companies with more diverse workforces outperform their competitors, and the best and brightest job seekers do not want to work for a CEO who makes 1,000 times more than everyone else. But is it this simple? Is shareholder, activism always win-win?
Advocacy, shareholder advocacy.
Shareholder advocacy, is it always win-win?
I really haven't seen those, to be honest. I mean, if I'm a shareholder or representing a shareholder, I want my company to thrive. I want my company to thrive today and tomorrow and 10, 20, and 30 years from now. So that's what I'm trying to help them actually take a longer time horizon view. I think part of the problem is some companies take a much shorter time horizon view, and often you need to make an investment in order to reap rewards in the future.
Shifting gears a little bit here, what would you like to see in-house engagement and stewardship teams that asset managers do differently?
I'd like to see asset managers engage much more fully. They do it to a point. So a BlackRock engagement, there's a common term, it's called a tea and crumpets engagement, where tea and cookies, I think, where they call up a company and go, hi, we're BlackRock. We own 7% of your company. We want to sit down and talk about climate risk or racial justice risk or whatever risk it is. And they go, look, here's the guidelines for this conversation. No matter what is said here, we will not escalate to a shareholder resolution. We will not vote against your board. We will do no escalations. What's for lunch? And it's like when you start a negotiation by saying there's no escalation, how far is it going to go? Okay, yes, I understand BlackRock owns 7% and they want you to do better and they want you to reduce risk. But if BlackRock said, if you don't, we have the power to actually vote people off of your board because they're not doing their proper job of oversight. That would have a real impact and would help BlackRock's portfolios. BlackRock's got this fiduciary duty issue where when you're a universal owner, when you own every company and a handful of companies within your portfolio are harming all the other companies and causing your portfolio to decline, you need to engage those companies to shift that circumstance. And they're just simply not doing the job. They might have the conversations, but they don't have the ability or they've made a decision not to escalate. If BlackRock were filing shareholder resolutions, if BlackRock were running board candidates, I think you would see companies that are heading toward a cliff actually shift their trajectory and do much better on a longer time horizon. So that's what I want to see. For Vanguard does nothing. Vanguard just says, we're non-invasive. We just vote with management and we keep our fees low and you're going to own the entire extractive economy. And that's just what we do. So if you've got your money in Vanguard, you have said, I am fine with investing in an unlivable planet and a company who supports that. I want to vote for that.
And what about Fidelity?
About the same. All of their target date funds, all of their 401k plans, all their retirement plans are all the same thing. It's the entire economy. That's what they have pitched, and people bought into it and said, yeah, I want the whole economy, even though the whole economy is the problem and that we need to, and the markets are sending signals, very strong ones, that we are shifting from an extractive model to a regenerative model. And for people to get ahead of that curve and to get on top of that and put their capital toward justice, toward sustainability, means that they are going to outperform. They're going to, over the long term. It's like you have to think long term.
You're not seeing an improvement at all in the level of engagement taking place from the asset manager side?
I'm seeing it reduce, actually. I'm seeing BlackRock voted with management more this year than they did the previous year. And no, they're going the wrong direction. BlackRock is absolutely heading the wrong direction. Vanguard's always been the wrong direction. Vanguard approves 98% of the CEO pay packages. I mean, the fact that these CEOs are massively overpaid. Now, for 10 years, we've been doing a report called the 100 Most Overpaid CEOs of the S&P 500. If you took the S&P 500 and you remove the 10 companies who overpay their CEOs the most, you outperform the benchmark by like 3-4 percentage points. The companies that are overpaying their CEOs are doing the worst financially. It's been consistent. People use it as an investing theme. They literally invest in the S&P 490 based on our thing, and they are outperforming. And the companies are, I don't know, people are just not observing this. And we put it out there. This is all free information. We publicize it. I don't know.
And what do you think about asset managers who delegate it to ISS and Glass Lewis?
Well, ISS and Glass Lewis are just totally conflicted. ISS makes its money selling data to the very companies that they're going to then go grade the CEO pay. So you're going to your customer and going, I think you're making too much money. I don't think they're doing it. There's too much conflict of interest. I think that's the problem there. And so their benchmark voting is basically with management, a little bit different. Their sustainable is basically with management. I got to say, compared to As You Vote, ISS SRI, which is considered to be the most ESG aligned of all of their policies, they only vote against 20% of the CEO pay packages. As You Vote votes against 80%. So an actual inversion. Again, we're voting against 80%, they're voting against 20%. On boards, we vote against 70%. They vote against 30%. On pro ESG resolutions, we vote for 100%. They vote for about 90%. So they're good there. Anti ESG resolutions, and these are the resolutions by Leonard Leo and his pals, to basically just to throw a monkey wrench into the system. They never get more than 2% vote, but they're more like, a racial justice resolution says white men are discriminated against. They're just, nobody takes them seriously. But they vote for 20% of those. And so you just go, wait a minute, that's ISS SRI. That's the best you can do. And people are like, oh, it's so, out there for ESG, but no one's looking at how they actually vote. They just look at the name. Right. So we do an actual comparison on a vote by vote basis. And I can tell you, As You Vote is actually ESG aligned in a real way.
We've been talking, almost exclusively about the public companies, and that's where most shareholder engagement discussion focuses on. But over recent decades, companies have been staying in the private markets for longer and longer. Do you see scope for engaging with companies and owners in the private markets?
So we just launched a private equity group within As You Sow to try to figure it out, because first of all, there's publicly traded private equities like KKR, Apollo, Carlyle, and Blackstone. These are massive companies that are being traded publicly, but they're not disclosing as if they're a publicly traded company because they're like, we're private equity. So we don't know anything about the hundreds of portfolio companies. And we're saying to them and to the SEC, well, wait a minute. If you're a publicly traded company, we need to see, at least your aggregated disclosure of all the companies. So first off, there's a disclosure issue that we believe needs to be addressed with private equity. And then the second thing is, the pension funds, the CalPERS, CalPSTers, all those who have a chunk of their money in private equity, they need to be asking those questions. They need to be doing the engaging and possibly moving their money out because a lot of the private equity is out of alignment with their stated values. So there's a lot of secrecy. We like transparency. We think investors deserve transparency. So that's what we're doing. We haven't quite figured out exactly how to get there yet. The other thing we're working on is bonds. Right now, there's not a lot of information about bonds. Basically what the coupon is. You're going to know what you're going to get paid back. That's all people care about with bonds. I'm going to loan you money. Will I get paid back and at what rate? We're saying, well, what about use of funds? And in a lot of the issuances, there's actually requirements for use of funds that never actually get done. So we're working with a lot of these bond traders. We've actually just organized, into kind of an informational group just to talk about this. And we're thinking about possibly filing our first bondholder resolution with the treasurer and the CFO of a company to ask them questions about their bond issuances that weren't made public, even though they were required, in the issuance. So again, transparency.
But these are the public markets again, though, right?
Bonds are, the fixed income market, which is maybe not as much of a black box as private equity, but there's a lot of information. There's a lot of gaps in the information, for sure.
But there's some interesting people playing. I've had some conversations with, like Blue Bay Asset Management and Columbia Threadneedle, and they're doing some interesting things using the debt instruments.
Absolutely, but there just needs to be, I think, greater transparency is what when a company is transparent and they lay it out and go, this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is our trajectory, this is where we're trying to get to. It's like for GPS to work, you need to know where you are and where you want to go. And right now, we don't know where we are. And the company's just saying, well, this is where we want to go. And it's very hard to track it. So we need accuracy. And I think that investors will actually reward companies for that honesty. And then if you don't get to your milestone in the first year, to explain why you need a course correction. And so it's really about, developing this trust between the companies and the folks who own them. The boards of every company report to their shareholders. We are the boss, ultimately. And so if a board isn't doing their proper oversight, the board should be replaced. And that oversight is setting strategy and incentivizing the executives through their pay and through their compensation packages to actually get the strategy executed. That's their job. And if they're not doing that, then they're not doing their job. They should be replaced. So ultimately that's how capitalism works. That's kind of the beautiful thing about it.
So today, Andrew, you've pulled back the curtain for some listeners, a lot of listeners, I imagine, on some troubling corporate practices. But these are huge companies, and even you have a relatively large operation that you're running.
People who feel frustrated and who feel like they're the victim, that all this stuff is happening, whether it's just that the social fabric is being shredded, that our atmosphere, our oceans are being lost, that all these ecosystems are being destroyed, have to realize that they have the power. You need to look in a mirror and see an empowered person. Because if you have any wealth at all, you have incredible amount of influence that you are not using. So, number one, look in a mirror, see an empowered person. Number two, when you go to work, look at your retirement plan. If you're invested in a dying planet, then shift your capital. If your plan doesn't offer you anything for other than a dead planet, talk to your administrator. They have to. And if they won't, talk to some of your peers. If 10 of you, 20, 100 go into that office and go, there's nothing for us to invest in, they're going to have to change. They're going to have to offer you something. So shift your capital into a thriving planet with justice and sustainability. So that's number one. Now, that should not take that much effort to do. You will hit some resistance, but it's absolutely worth it. Number two, where do you bank? Are you banking at JP Morgan, the number one company that funds extraction projects? Or where's your credit card? Like, look at where you spend your money. There's now new apps coming out where you can literally decide, I'm going to buy this sneaker or that sneaker, and one of them is going to have a much better racial justice or DEI score. When you buy those sneakers, write to the other company and say, I didn't buy your sneaker because your score is low. Write to this company and say, I bought your sneaker because your score is high. 10 messages like that, 10 posts, they make a difference. The companies are listening. It's just use your power. You have so much power if you even have $100 in your bank account. It's amazing. And people don't realize it. Young people are not trained in this. Young people that don't understand that they have this power. They get to their first job. They just go, I'll just go drop my retirement into the default option. Fine. I'll invest in the extractive economy. And you're now part of that system. You're part of the destruction. So this is the moment in time where, if 100 million people said, we're going to take our $10 trillion and we want to put it into sustainable investing and we want to vote, suddenly every corporation would have a climate transition plan, a racial justice plan, and they'd be executing on them really well. So it's really just about folks realizing how powerful they are and exerting that.
Don't forget the online tools that we mentioned earlier that you have developed. And I set you up beautifully to plug your book.
I appreciate that. Yes, I did write a book. Well, it was in 2016. It feels like a very long time ago.
Well, it does, but is it relevant? I imagine it is. No?
It is. It's a book about storytelling. I tell the stories of all of the heroes of shareholder advocacy, the faith-based community and people who really started this whole idea that shareholders have power. It's called the Shareholder Action Guide, and I guess it's available on Amazon. I don't even know anymore. It was published by Barrett Kohler.
Somewhere in my research, I saw a picture of you ripping your shirt open, Clark Kent style, and I think that's on the cover of the book as well, right? And
that's actually, the book cover is on my shirt, and I'm because the cover of the book is somebody ripping their shirt open. So I was trying to be.
At first, I think I saw the photo of you first, and I thought, no, I don't get this. And then after I saw the book, now I go, okay, now I get it. Yeah. If you had to name, the one most important challenge to shareholder engagement in the ESG public equity space at this time, what would it be?
Probably perception, that people still think that it's adversarial and it's very cooperative. It's helping companies, and the relationships with the companies, the companies see it as positive as well. So I think shifting the mindset that this is actually a very positive activity.
What do you know now about shareholder engagement that you wish you knew when you joined As You Sow in 2010?
I'd say the power of the individual, that now that we're doing As You Vote, now that we're enabled every person who owns shares to vote, the 25% of people who don't vote, who are sitting on the sidelines, can, at no cost, with one click, get onto the field. If 25% of people were voting, 25% more were voting, it would be a game changer. It literally would change the vote outcomes and also get those people engaged. So I think we've never really spoken to those individuals. We've only ever been speaking to these institutional. And so I think it's really important to activate that 25%.
You don't have to name names, but could you describe a campaign that you were sure that you were going to win or be successful with, but in the end you didn't? And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
We thought for sure that when we talked to Amazon and said, hey, we can help you create a sustainable 401k plan that matches your stated sustainability goals. You guys are putting out 100,000 electric vehicles. You've got your data centers completely running on renewables. I'm sure you want all of your employees to have fossil-free options and sustainable options and to vote. And I just thought they were going to go, oh, wow, thank you, guys. Let's go take a victory lap together. We can get this done in the next few months. And instead, actually, it was funny. It's the first meeting. All the people at Amazon, they were like, I own private prisons. I own that. Oh my God. And we showed them, we took them through their own plan. They were like, oh, wow, we're going to escalate this. We're going to get this done. And we were like, yes. And then the next meeting, it was just a room full of lawyers. And they literally said, we can either confirm or deny. We can either confirm or deny. And at the end of an hour, I said, well, should we talk about next steps? And they said, why? They was just completely shut it down. And we left the meeting going like, wow, what happened there? What happened to all our friends who were so impassioned last meeting? So something happened. We don't know what, but obviously somebody high up said, do not change, do not align our sustainability goals with our money. We like cognitive dissonance. I don't know.
The converse of that, could you describe a campaign that you were not sure you were going to succeed? Or maybe you thought you weren't, but in the end you did, and the results maybe were beyond your wildest expectations. And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
I mentioned before the Abbott Labs. We filed that resolution. The first year we got a 3.2% vote. You need 3% to come back the next year. This is about GMO labeling on Similac. The next year you need a 6% vote, and we got a 6.2 to come back the next year. The next year you needed 10%. We got a 6% vote. So we left the meeting going like, okay, well, that was 3 years. That was good work, but we didn't get there. And then literally a month later, I saw an ad for non-GMO Similac at Target. And it was like, they did it. They didn't even tell us. They adopted exactly our idea. And it was like, whoa. And then it became this bestseller. And then they started making it for tender tummies and liquid form and all these different things. And so that was just we thought it was over, but we actually had won and they never bothered to call. It was funny, as I bumped into the woman at a conference, the investor relations person. And I said, oh my gosh, Janet, how are you? And she's like, Andy, oh my gosh, how are you? And I said, so where's my fruit basket? I was kidding. And she's like, you're not getting a fruit basket. The people who were the most opposed to you are now running the division and taking full credit for it being their idea. And I said, that is the best news I've ever heard. Because when somebody personally invests in it or is getting a bonus from it, then I know it's part of the DNA of the company. I know it's going to continue. And I'd rather be in the background and quiet.
If someone wants to get into the shareholder engagement space, and I presume that we're talking about someone much less experienced than you and me, How would you advise them to get into the business if they wanted to make a career out of that? And where would be the best place for them to cut their teeth?
The way you get into it is vote, period. But if you want to make a career out of it, well, you could work for any number of asset managers. So Walden, Domini, Trillium, Boston. So all these folks are doing actual real engagement. Green Century. They're just doing amazing work, talking to the companies in their portfolio. So be doing that engagement work and then sometimes escalating as needed. We're the only nonprofit really focused on it. So if you want to, we're kind of the only game in town. A few others are starting to do it around the edges. But so I'd say I'd say learn about environmental, social, and governance risk metrics. That is the best way to get a job right now. They're literally every auditor, all the big four are hiring thousands of people because they realize that these measures are as significant to a company's success as the financial measures are. They are actually financial measures. They have this material impact. And so they're hiring because they're going to need to assess, they're helping companies to assess all of their risks. And so that's another way in.
I've really enjoyed this. I guess I'd have to add on to what you just said. My impression is that you've been, after this conversation, quite successful because you are partnering with the companies, or at least attempting to partner with them. And I suspect that originates from your years as being in business, actually, and not only having experience in a nonprofit or NGO type of environment. So I applaud you for that. And it's been very enlightening to learn much more on this. Is there anything else you would like to say to the listeners today? And also, how can people find you? I guess are you on Twitter? And
sure, I'm on X, and
that dated me, didn't it?
And I'm on LinkedIn, and you can if you go to As You Sow, SOW.org. It's like the biblical phrase, "As you sow, so shall ye reap." You can find me there under staff, and my email's there, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And everything from As You Sow has links to Invest Your Values. It has links to all of our reports. It has links to, As You Vote and all the different tools that we make. We're just like very busy building tools and doing research and talking to companies. And we generate a lot of material. So you can get on our mailing list. There's a place you can just put in your email. We don't overwhelm you, but we do newsletters, but we invite you to a lot of webinars, and we send you a lot of reports that we're doing, invite you to different sort of activities and things to learn how to use tools and just have access to all of our materials.
Great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to explain all of this. I've learned an awful lot, and I really appreciate the effort that you're making.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.